For 15 years, I had dreamed of building a backyard oasis. Not just any pool, but a retreat where my family could escape the summer heat and create memories that would last a lifetime. I saved diligently, researched meticulously, and finally broke ground last autumn. The construction took months of careful planning, permits, and inspections. Every detail was considered, from the natural stone waterfall to the saltwater filtration system, designed for minimal environmental impact. The day the contractors finished was one of the proudest moments of my life. I stood beside my wife as we watched our son cannonball into the deep end for the very first time. His laughter echoed across the water as sunlight danced on the surface. This was everything I had worked for, our own private paradise nestled behind our modest suburban home. The feeling of accomplishment lasted exactly 3 days before the first sign of trouble appeared. I was skimming leaves from the water when a sharp voice cut through the tranquility. "Excuse me, I need to inspect the premises." I turned to find a woman standing at my gate, clipboard in hand, her expression pinched with disapproval. I recognized her immediately. Karen Wilcox, president of our neighborhood homeowners association. She wore her authority like armor, her pearl necklace gleaming in the afternoon sun. "I did not realize an inspection was scheduled," I replied, setting down my pool skimmer. Karen did not wait for an invitation. She pushed through the gate and began walking the perimeter of my pool as if she owned it. "All new construction requires HOA approval and final inspection. You should have received notification." I had received no such notification. However, I had secured all the proper permits and approvals before construction began. I had the paperwork to prove it. "I have all the necessary documentation," I explained, maintaining a cordial tone. "The city inspector signed off last week." Karen scoffed. "City approval is irrelevant. The HOA has final authority over all external structures." She scribbled something on her clipboard, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed my backyard. "This is quite extensive for a personal installation." "It is within my property boundaries and meets all code requirements," I stated firmly. Karen paused near the stone waterfall, running her finger along the edge. "Are you aware of the shared use clause in our community guidelines?" I was not. In fact, I had never heard of such a thing during the 3 years we had lived in the neighborhood. "What shared use clause?" "Section 7, paragraph 12. Recreational installations exceeding certain dimensions may be subject to community accessibility requirements." Her smile did not reach her eyes. "Your pool appears to qualify." "That cannot be right," I protested. "This is private property." Karen shrugged, unconcerned with my objection. "The board will review and make a determination. Expect official communication within the week." She turned and walked out through my gate without another word. True to her word, 7 days later, an official-looking envelope arrived in my mailbox. The letter inside stated that the HOA board had voted unanimously to designate my newly constructed pool as a community recreational amenity, under an obscure bylaw I had never seen before. I read the letter 3 times in disbelief. According to this document, I was now required to allow reasonable access to community members during daylight hours. My private investment had just been declared public property with the stroke of a pen. The next morning, I marched to the community center where HOA meetings were held. I demanded to speak with someone, anyone who could explain this outrageous decision. The secretary at the front desk merely handed me a copy of the bylaws and suggested I file a formal appeal. I spent hours poring over the dense legal language. The clause Karen had mentioned existed, but it was clearly intended for developments that had received community funding or were built on shared land. My pool met neither criterion. I submitted a formal appeal the next day, complete with documentation proving my pool was entirely on my property and privately funded. The response was a form letter denying my request without explanation. 3 days later, I returned home from work to find a middle-aged couple lounging on my pool chairs. The woman waved casually as if this were perfectly normal. "Excuse me," I said, setting down my briefcase. "This is private property." The man looked confused. But Karen said the new pool is open to residents. We are just enjoying the community amenity. There has been a misunderstanding, I explained, trying to remain polite. This pool is not a community amenity. It was built with my personal funds on my private property. They gathered their things reluctantly, muttering about checking with the HOA. But they were just the first. The next day, a group of teenagers showed up with floats and speakers. The day after that, an elderly man arrived with a folding chair and a novel, settling in for what appeared to be a long afternoon by the neighborhood pool. Each time I explained the situation. Each time they left confused, insisting that Karen or another board member had explicitly told them the pool was available for community use. I filed another complaint with the HOA. This time I requested a formal hearing. The response was the same cold silence. When I called Karen directly, she answered with thinly veiled contempt. "The board has already ruled on this matter," she said dismissively. "If you continue to obstruct community access, you will be subject to fines for violation of HOA regulations." That night, as I watched strangers peering over my fence, I realized what was happening. This was not a misunderstanding. It was targeted harassment. For whatever reason, the HOA had decided to make an example of me. My frustration transformed into something darker, a slow-burning determination to fight back. What they did not know was that they had chosen the wrong person to bully. The situation escalated beyond my worst nightmares on a sunny Saturday in June. I had been away since early morning, running errands and visiting my mother across town. As I turned onto our street around 3 in the afternoon, I noticed the unusual number of cars lining both sides of the road. Music thumped in the distance, growing louder as I approached my house. My stomach sank when I realized the source. The music was coming from my backyard. I parked haphazardly in my driveway, which was partially blocked by unfamiliar vehicles. A large banner hung across my front porch. "Willow Creek Community Summer Kickoff Pool Bash," complete with cartoonish water splashes and the HOA logo. I ran through my side gate and froze at the scene before me. My backyard had been transformed into a crowded public pool party. Dozens, no, at least 100 people filled every inch of my property. Children splashed in the pool while adults lounged on chairs that had been brought in from elsewhere. My outdoor kitchen had been commandeered as a makeshift bar, bottles of alcohol lining the countertops I had installed with my own hands. "What is happening here?" I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the blaring speakers someone had set up beside my pool house. I pushed through the crowd, searching for someone in charge. People looked at me with mild annoyance, as if I were interrupting their good time. A woman I did not recognize spilled her drink on my shirt as I squeezed past. "Sorry, buddy," she slurred. "Great party, though." I finally spotted Karen near the deep end of the pool, surrounded by other HOA board members. They were laughing, drinks in hand, watching the chaos with satisfaction. I approached them, barely containing my rage. "Karen, what have you done?" I demanded. "You had no right to organize this. This is my private property." Karen turned to me with exaggerated surprise. "Oh, look who decided to join us. We were wondering where you were." "I did not authorize this. You need to end this immediately and get these people off my property." One of the other board members, a balding man named Richard, chuckled. "According to the HOA bylaws, this is a community space now. We sent out notices to all residents last week about the summer kickoff." "I never received any notice," I said through gritted teeth. "Must have gotten lost in the mail," Karen replied with mock sympathy. "Anyway, no need to make a scene. Everyone is having such a lovely time." I pulled out my phone. "I am calling the police. This is trespassing." That was when Richard stepped forward, his considerable bulk blocking my path. "I would not do that if I were you. By signing the HOA agreement when you moved in, you consented to all community bylaws, including shared recreational spaces." "This is not a shared space," I shouted loud enough that nearby conversations paused. Karen smiled coldly. "Maybe you should check the documentation again. In the meantime, try to enjoy the party. Your neighbors certainly are." I looked around at the destruction of my property. Trash floated in my pool. Someone had spilled what looked like barbecue sauce on my custom stonework. A group of teenagers were climbing on my waterfall feature, posing for photos. "This ends now," I declared, pushing past Richard toward the outdoor sound system. As I reached for the power cord, two men intercepted me. I recognized them as HOA board members, though I did not know their names. "That would be violating the Community Enjoyment Clause," one said, crossing his arms over his chest. The situation was spiraling out of control. I retreated to my house and called a private security company, explaining the situation and requesting immediate assistance. While I waited, I documented everything, taking photos and videos of the unauthorized gathering. An hour later, two security guards arrived. They attempted to disperse the crowd, explaining that they had been hired by the homeowner, me, to clear the property. Karen intercepted them immediately. "This is an authorized community event," she insisted, producing a document that appeared to be on official HOA letterhead. "This man does not have the authority to exclude residents from a designated community space." The lead security guard looked between Karen and me, clearly confused by the conflicting claims. "Sir," he said to me quietly, "if this is an HOA dispute, we cannot intervene without a court order. This appears to be a civil matter." Before I could respond, Richard and another board member approached the security guards. "You need to leave now," Richard said menacingly. "You are disrupting a neighborhood function." When the guards hesitated, one of the board members knocked the radio from the security guard's hand, sending it crashing into the bushes. The crowd cheered as if it were all part of the entertainment. My wife appeared at my side, our 10-year-old son clinging to her leg. "They will not let us through to our own house," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Someone followed us to the front door, telling us we need to join the party or go away." That was the breaking point. I escorted my family inside through the mob, locking the doors behind us. Through the windows, we watched strangers treating our personal sanctuary like a public park. My son asked why all these people were in our backyard. I had no reasonable explanation to give him. Several partygoers noticed us watching from inside. One man, clearly intoxicated, pressed his face against our window and made obscene gestures. Another woman took out her phone and began recording us, laughing with her friends. I documented everything, every violation, every act of disrespect, every moment of this orchestrated humiliation, because beneath my outward shock, a plan was already forming. The HOA thought they were teaching me a lesson in power. They had no idea what real power looked like. The party continued until after sunset. No one bothered to clean up. Beer cans floated in my pool. Food waste attracted flies around my outdoor kitchen. My carefully cultivated garden beds had been trampled beyond recognition. As the last stragglers departed, Karen approached my front door. I met her on the porch, my face expressionless. "Next time you should join in the fun," she said with false cheerfulness. "It is so much nicer than fighting the inevitable." She handed me a notice, a cleaning fee assessment for post-event maintenance of the community pool area. The amount, $750, due within 30 days. I took the paper without a word and closed the door. Inside, I added it to my growing file of evidence. The HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their existence. They just did not know it yet. The following week, I took a rare personal day from work. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with and how deep this corruption went. I spread the HOA guidelines, community charter, and bylaws across my dining room table. The documents were dense, filled with legal jargon and circular references that made them nearly impenetrable to the average homeowner. I started from the beginning, highlighting contradictions and vague clauses that could be manipulated. The shared use provision Karen had cited did exist, but its original context was completely different from how they were applying it. It referred specifically to amenities built using funds from the community development budget, not private installations. Hours into my research, I discovered something peculiar. The HOA had amended this particular bylaw just 3 months earlier, broadening its scope with ambiguous language. The timing could not be coincidental. It was almost as if they had changed the rules specifically to target my pool. But why? What had I done to deserve this level of harassment? I dug deeper, requesting meeting minutes from the past year through a formal public records request. The HOA was required to maintain these documents and make them available to homeowners. Their reluctance to provide them was telling. It took 3 separate requests and a threat of legal action before I received a heavily redacted packet. Even with the redactions, the minutes revealed a pattern. Over the past 2 years, several homeowners had been targeted with similar aggressive enforcement actions. Most sold their homes and moved rather than fight. Those who stayed faced escalating fines and harassment until they fell in line. There was another common thread. All the targeted homeowners were either new to the neighborhood or had declined to participate in HOA social functions. They were perceived as outsiders. One name kept appearing in connection with pool-related disputes: Karen Wilcox. I searched older records and found mention of a rejected application from 5 years ago. Karen had submitted plans for an elaborate backyard pool, but her proposal was denied by the city due to drainage issues and proximity to a protected wetland area. The picture became clearer. This was not just arbitrary bullying, it was personal resentment metastasized into abuse of power. Karen could not have her pool, so she would control mine instead. I needed allies. Cautiously, I began reaching out to neighbors who might have experienced similar treatment. Most were reluctant to speak openly, fearful of becoming the next target. Behind closed doors, however, they shared their stories. The Martinez family had been fined repeatedly for their vegetable garden, despite it being within guidelines. The Thompsons faced weekly lawn quality inspections after questioning an assessment increase. The elderly Mr. Chen had been reduced to tears when the HOA demanded he remove the memorial garden planted for his late wife, claiming it violated landscaping uniformity requirements. Each story reinforced what I already suspected. This was not an HOA functioning to maintain community standards. It was a small group of people who had discovered the intoxicating rush of unchecked authority. I consulted with a real estate attorney, bringing my growing file of evidence. She reviewed the documents with increasing concern. "This is not just petty power abuse," she explained, setting down the summer kickoff party photos. "There are potential legal violations here. Unauthorized entry, conversion of private property, possible insurance fraud if they represented your pool as a community asset." "Can I sue them?" I asked. She sighed, tapping her pen against the desk. "You could, but HOA litigation is notoriously prolonged and expensive. These organizations typically have substantial legal funds built into their budgets specifically to outlast individual homeowners in court. So they just get away with it?" "Not necessarily," she replied thoughtfully. "The key is to find leverage outside their system. HOAs derive their power from a closed ecosystem of rules they control. The solution often lies in finding an external authority they cannot manipulate." Her words planted a seed. An external authority they could not manipulate. I thanked her and left, my mind already shifting toward a different strategy altogether. When I returned home, a fresh notice was taped to my front door. The HOA was fining me $3,000 for unauthorized restriction of community access to designated shared recreational facilities. The fine would double if not paid within 14 days. That evening, Karen herself appeared at my door, accompanied by Richard and another board member. Their presence was clearly meant to intimidate. "We wanted to discuss your continued noncompliance," Karen began, her voice dripping with false concern. "The board is very disappointed in your hostility toward community initiatives." "I am not paying the fine," I stated calmly. Karen's smile tightened. "Then we will have no choice but to place a lien on your property. Additionally, we may have to consider restricting your own access to community amenities, including your pool." "My pool," I repeated slowly. "The community pool located on your property," Richard corrected with smug precision. "Perhaps it would be easier if you simply accepted the situation. Most people come to understand that fighting the HOA only makes things more difficult. I looked at each of them in turn, maintaining a neutral expression that concealed the storm brewing within me. Thank you for the visit. I will take your comments under advisement. Karen seemed disappointed by my subdued reaction. She had clearly expected an emotional outburst she could use against me later. The disciplinary committee meets next Thursday. Your case is first on the agenda. I suggest you prepare a formal apology if you want any leniency. After they left, I sat down at my computer and opened a folder I had not touched since this conflict began. It contained my work email, official letterhead, and credentials for the state environmental management system. What Karen and her cronies did not know, what they had not bothered to learn about the homeowner they were systematically harassing, was that I was not just another resident they could bully into submission. In their arrogance, they had failed to discover that they were targeting the state water commissioner responsible for overseeing all water usage, management, and compliance in our region. Their reckoning was about to begin. Few people understand what a state water commissioner actually does. The title sounds bureaucratic, perhaps even ceremonial to those unfamiliar with environmental regulation. In reality, my position carries substantial authority over water resource management, conservation enforcement, and regulatory compliance throughout the state. My department oversees everything from municipal water treatment facilities to private well permits. We enforce drought restrictions, monitor watershed quality, and ensure that developments adhere to state environmental codes. Most importantly, we have the power to audit any entity's water usage and halt operations that violate state regulations. I had kept my professional role separate from my neighborhood life, not out of secrecy, but from a desire to maintain a boundary between work and home. That boundary was now irrelevant. I began methodically, as any proper investigation should. First, I requested all HOA water usage records for the past 5 years through official channels. This was not a personal vendetta. It was my job to investigate potential water mismanagement when credible concerns arose. And I certainly had concerns. While waiting for those records, I conducted a preliminary site assessment of the neighborhood's irrigation systems, water features, and drainage infrastructure. I documented numerous issues immediately visible to a trained eye. Inefficient sprinkler placement causing unnecessary runoff, decorative fountains operating outside permitted hours, and most concerning, evidence of unauthorized modifications to storm drain systems. The HOA records arrived with suspicious gaps and inconsistencies. Reported water usage for common areas fluctuated dramatically without explanation. Permits for recent landscape modifications were either missing or improperly filed. The certification for the neighborhood's decorative pond was 3 years expired. I cross-referenced their submissions with County Water Authority data and found significant discrepancies. The HOA had consistently underreported their water consumption, likely to avoid higher-tier pricing for excessive usage. They had also classified certain wasteful decorative features as essential infrastructure to circumvent drought restriction policies. Each violation I documented was not just a technical infringement, but a reflection of the same entitled disregard for rules that had led them to commandeer my private property. The difference was that, while they could manipulate HOA bylaws at will, state water regulations were beyond their control. I compiled my findings into a formal audit request and submitted it through proper channels. I recused myself from direct oversight due to personal involvement, but as the initiating commissioner, I would remain informed of all findings. My colleagues, seeing the substantial preliminary evidence, prioritized the case. Within days, the State Environmental Protection Division launched a comprehensive review of the Willow Creek HOA's water management practices. Inspectors arrived unannounced to examine irrigation systems, water features, and drainage infrastructure. They requested maintenance records, contractor agreements, and detailed water usage logs going back 5 years. The HOA board received formal notice that their water permits were under review and that certain high-consumption activities would be suspended during the investigation. This included the operation of all decorative water features, non-essential irrigation, and the filling of any pools or ponds. I made sure this last restriction specifically exempted existing, properly permitted private pools, a category that included only mine in the entire neighborhood. The notice did not mention my name or position. It was a standard regulatory communication that gave no indication of the connection between their targeted homeowner and the sudden scrutiny they faced. Karen received the official letter on a Tuesday morning. By afternoon, emergency HOA board meeting notices had been distributed throughout the neighborhood. From my home office window, I watched her marching from house to house, gesturing frantically as she spoke with other board members. That evening my phone rang. It was Karen. "This is outrageous," she began without greeting. "The state has no right to interfere with our community management." "I understand this must be concerning," I replied neutrally. "May I ask what specifically you are referring to?" "Do not play innocent," she snapped. "This water audit, it appears someone has filed a malicious complaint against the HOA. I assume you know something about it." I maintained my professional tone. "As a homeowner, I received the same community notice you distributed. It sounds like the state has concerns about water usage compliance. I am sure if everything is in order, the audit will conclude quickly. We need this resolved immediately. The summer landscape plan requires consistent irrigation. Our reputation depends on maintaining our common areas to certain standards." "I expect the regulatory process will take its course," I replied. "If you believe there has been an error, I suggest contacting the department directly." She paused, her breathing audible through the phone. "We know this is your doing somehow. This will not change anything about the pool situation." I allowed myself a small smile she could not see. "I am not sure how a state environmental audit relates to our HOA disagreement, Karen, but I wish you the best of luck with the inspection." 3 days later, the preliminary audit results revealed exactly what I expected: multiple violations of state water conservation statutes, improper modification of drainage systems, and falsified usage reporting. The HOA was immediately placed under a Stage 3 water restriction order, the most severe category short of complete shutdown. All community irrigation was halted. The decorative fountains at the neighborhood entrances were drained. The elaborate landscape lighting water features throughout common areas were powered down. Most significantly, all community construction or modification involving water systems was suspended indefinitely. The HOA received notice that these restrictions would remain in effect until they demonstrated full compliance with state regulations and paid all associated fines and remediation costs. The estimated timeline, 3 to 6 months minimum. Still, Karen and her board did not make the connection. They believed they were victims of bureaucratic overreach, perhaps triggered by an anonymous complaint. They had no idea that the quiet homeowner they had chosen to bully was systematically dismantling their power, using the full legal authority of his position. This was not revenge. It was justice administered through proper channels, and it was only beginning. By the 3rd week of the water restriction order, Willow Creek Estates had transformed dramatically. The once lush common areas had faded to a dull brown. The grand entrance, previously a showcase of flowing fountains and verdant landscaping, now featured empty concrete basins and withering ornamental plants. Local news vans parked at the community center as reporters sought comments on what they were calling the mystery audit that dried up paradise. Their cameras captured shots of the HOA's prized rose garden, now a collection of brittle stems and fallen petals. Karen called an emergency community meeting in the clubhouse. I attended quietly, taking a seat in the back row. The room was packed with frustrated homeowners, many fanning themselves in the summer heat now made worse by the dying landscape. Karen stood at the podium, her usual confidence visibly shaken. "We are working diligently to resolve this unfair targeting by state officials," she began, her voice cracking slightly. We have hired specialized legal counsel to fight these baseless accusations. A homeowner near the front raised his hand. What exactly are we being accused of? The notice mentioned multiple violations. Karen waved dismissively. Technical misunderstandings, nothing substantial. Richard took over, attempting to project authority. The important thing to remember is that this is temporary. Our attorney assures us we can have the restrictions lifted within days. This was a blatant lie. The violations documented in the audit would require extensive remediation and substantial fines. Their attorney would have told them this. Another homeowner stood up. My property value is dropping by the day. This neighborhood looks abandoned. What are our monthly dues paying for if not to prevent this exact situation? The meeting devolved into shouting as more residents demanded answers. For the first time, I saw cracks forming in the board's united front. Several members sat silently, distancing themselves from Karen's increasingly desperate assertions. We believe this was initiated by someone with a grudge against our community, Karen declared, scanning the room. Her eyes passed over me without recognition. Someone who wants to see our property values decline. A woman I recognized as a newer resident stood up. Is this related to all those parties at the Johnson pool? I heard that was not actually authorized. Karen glared at her. Community amenities are not relevant to this discussion. But we received a notice about increased dues to cover pool maintenance, another resident interjected. If that pool is private property, why are we paying for it? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Seeds of doubt had been planted. The board hastily called an end to the meeting, promising updates as information became available. That night, I made my next move. I had compiled a comprehensive document detailing the HOA's pattern of bylaw manipulation, selective enforcement, and financial inconsistencies. I included records showing how they had changed rules to target specific homeowners, including the recent amendment that had allowed them to claim my pool as community property. I anonymously delivered printed copies to every mailbox in the neighborhood. The reaction was immediate. By morning, the community message board was flooded with outraged posts from homeowners who had discovered their own experiences were part of a pattern. People who had remained silent out of fear now found collective courage in numbers. Karen's phone must have been ringing constantly. She stopped answering her door. Richard was seen loading files into his car late at night. 3 days later, a formal petition circulated calling for an emergency board election. It gathered signatures from over 70% of homeowners within hours. That afternoon, Karen appeared at my front door alone. Her carefully maintained appearance had deteriorated. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched a folder. "You," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "It was you all along." I stood in my doorway, saying nothing. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" she continued, her voice rising. "Years of work building this community, maintaining standards, preserving property values, all threatened because you would not share a swimming pool." "I did not refuse to share," I corrected calmly. "I refuse to have my private property seized without consent or compensation. There is a significant difference." She laughed bitterly. "Oh, spare me the semantics. You know what this community was like before we took control. Unkempt lawns, unapproved paint colors, children's toys left in front yards. Chaos. We brought order and value." "You brought tyranny," I replied. "There is a difference between maintaining community standards and abusing power for personal vendettas." She stepped closer, jabbing a finger toward my chest. "You think you are so clever with your anonymous complaints. The water department will realize they have been manipulated eventually." I allowed myself a small smile. The water department is conducting a legitimate audit based on substantial evidence of violations. There is nothing anonymous about the investigation. Karen's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" I reached into my pocket and removed my official identification card, holding it where she could clearly read the title, State Water Commissioner. The color drained from her face as realization dawned. "You cannot do this. It is a conflict of interest. You are abusing your position because of a personal dispute. On the contrary, I replied evenly. I recused myself from direct oversight of the case due to my residence in the affected community. The audit is being conducted by independent inspectors who have documented multiple significant violations of state water regulations. Their findings would be the same regardless of who initiated the review. She stared at me in stunned silence. However, I continued, as a homeowner who has been systematically harassed by the HOA, subjected to unauthorized entry of my property, and falsely charged for community access to my private installations, I do have standing to pursue separate civil action. The documentation I have assembled would be quite compelling in court. Karen's composure crumbled completely. What do you want? Accountability, I answered simply. The immediate rescinding of all fines against me, formal acknowledgement that my pool is private property, and your resignation from the HOA board. You cannot force me to resign, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. No, I cannot, I agreed. But I can ensure that every violation documented in the water audit is prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, with maximum penalties. The resulting fines would likely necessitate a special assessment for all homeowners. I imagine that would make you extremely unpopular. She turned and walked away without another word, leaving me standing in my doorway. I watched her retreat down the sidewalk, her shoulders hunched in defeat. That evening, a new notice appeared on the community board. The summer landscape plan had been indefinitely postponed due to unforeseen regulatory compliance issues. Special assessment notices for water violation fines would be distributed the following week. The HOA's kingdom was crumbling, one dried-up rosebush at a time. #Bricks Part 6, Judgment Pool. 4 weeks after the state water audit began, the final report was released. It was devastating in its comprehensiveness. 27 distinct violations of state water conservation statutes. 11 instances of improper drainage modification, 6 cases of falsified usage reporting. The total fines exceeded $175,000. More damaging than the financial penalties was the required remediation plan. The HOA would need to completely redesign their irrigation systems, replace decorative water features with drought-resistant alternatives, and submit to quarterly inspections for a minimum of 3 years. The day after the report became public, notices for an emergency community meeting appeared throughout the neighborhood. Unlike previous meetings controlled by the board, this one had been called by concerned homeowners invoking a rarely used bylaw allowing for community-initiated sessions. The clubhouse was filled beyond capacity. Residents stood along walls and spilled out onto the patio. Karen and the other board members sat at the front table looking shell-shocked. A respected retired judge who lived in the community had been asked to moderate. He called the meeting to order and established ground rules for civil discussion. Then he opened the floor to the board for an initial statement. Karen approached the microphone slowly. I had never seen her look so defeated. The board acknowledges receipt of the state water audit findings, she began, her voice barely audible. We are reviewing our options for addressing the citations. Reviewing options? Someone shouted from the crowd. You mean figuring out how to make us pay for your mistakes? The moderator called for order, but the damage was done. The community's anger was palpable. We have prepared a preliminary special assessment schedule, Richard said, sliding papers across the table. Unfortunately, compliance will require contributions from all homeowners. A chorus of objections erupted. The proposed assessment would cost each household nearly $2,000, payable within 60 days. Before we discuss financial matters, the moderator interjected, several residents have requested clarification on other issues raised in recent community correspondence. He nodded toward me. This was my cue. I had not planned to speak publicly, but the community deserved to hear the truth directly. I walked to the microphone, feeling the weight of every gaze. My name is James Miller. Many of you know me as the homeowner with the new pool that was recently designated a community amenity by the HOA board. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. What many of you do not know is that this designation occurred without my consent, using a bylaw that was amended specifically to target my property. I placed a copy of the original bylaw and its recent amendment on the projector. 3 months before my pool was completed, this clause was changed from applying only to amenities constructed with community funds to include recreational installations exceeding certain dimensions. This change was made without proper notification to homeowners. I continued methodically, presenting evidence of the pattern of targeted harassment, the unauthorized party, and the fraudulent billing for maintenance of my private property. The board not only seized effective control of my pool, but charged the community for its upkeep, creating a double fraud that victimized all of us. The board not only seized effective control of my pool, but charged the community for its upkeep, creating a double fraud that victimized all of us. Karen jumped to her feet. This is slander. We acted within our authority to manage community resources. The moderator gavelled for order. The board will have an opportunity to respond. Please allow Mr. Miller to finish. I placed my state identification on the projector so everyone could see it clearly. In my professional capacity as State Water Commissioner, I became aware of potential water regulation violations in our community. Following proper protocol, I initiated an official review while recusing myself from direct oversight due to my residence here. Gasps and whispers spread through the room as people connected the dots. The resulting audit was conducted by independent inspectors who documented numerous violations. These would have been discovered eventually during routine regulatory reviews. The only unusual aspect was the timing. I turned to face Karen directly. I did not abuse my position. I simply ensured that one system of rules, state environmental regulations, was properly enforced when another system, our HOA bylaws, was being manipulated for personal vendettas. Karen attempted to interject, but Richard placed a restraining hand on her arm, shaking his head slightly. I concluded with a simple statement. I am not asking for special treatment. I am asking for the same rights every homeowner deserves, to have my private property respected, to be protected from harassment, and to live in a community governed by fair and transparent rules. The room erupted in applause as I returned to my seat. Several neighbors patted my shoulder or nodded in support. When the noise subsided, the moderator turned to the board. Would you like to respond to these allegations? Karen approached the microphone, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. Mr. Miller has presented a very one-sided view of events. The board has always acted in the best interest of property values and community standards. If occasional strict enforcement is necessary, it is only to maintain the quality of life we all expect. Her defense fell flat. A homeowner stood up. Is it true you changed the bylaw specifically to target his pool? Bylaws are regularly reviewed and updated, Richard interjected evasively. Another resident called out. Did you authorize a party on his private property without permission? Karen's composure cracked. Community events are planned for community spaces if certain homeowners refuse to acknowledge the greater good. Answer the question, someone interrupted. The meeting continued in this vein for another hour. Each board defense was met with increasingly skeptical questions. Documents I had distributed earlier were referenced repeatedly, revealing the pattern of selective enforcement and rule manipulation. Finally, an elderly resident who rarely attended meetings stood up. Mrs. Chen, whose husband had been targeted over his memorial garden, spoke in a quiet but firm voice. I have lived in this neighborhood for 27 years. I remember when we formed the HOA to help maintain our common areas and prevent commercial development. It was meant to serve the community, not rule it. What has happened here is a perversion of that original purpose. She looked directly at the board. You should be ashamed, all of you. You have used rules meant to protect us to bully and harass your neighbors. You have spent our dues on personal vendettas, and now you expect us to pay for your violations." Her words hung in the air, powerful in their simple truth. The moderator called for order. "I believe we have heard enough to warrant formal action. According to HOA bylaws, the community may call for a vote of no confidence in the board if supported by a two-thirds majority." Hands shot up around the room. The count was overwhelming, 87% in favor. "The motion carries," the moderator announced. "A new board election will be held within 30 days. In the interim, a community committee will be formed to review all bylaws and financial records." He turned to the current board members. "You are requested to submit your resignations effective immediately. If you choose not to resign, be advised that the next action would be a formal recall vote, which appears to have sufficient support." Karen stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. "This is not over," she hissed, gathering her papers. Richard and two other board members quietly placed their resignation letters on the table. The remaining members, including Karen, stormed out without further comment. As the meeting concluded, the moderator asked for volunteers for the interim review committee. I stayed in my seat, feeling my part was done, but several neighbors approached, urging me to participate. "We need someone who understands how rules should work," Mrs. Chen said. "Someone who knows the difference between enforcement and harassment." Reluctantly, I agreed to serve as an advisor to the committee, but not as a voting member. My professional position required a certain separation from community governance to avoid any appearance of conflict. As people filed out of the clubhouse, a sense of cautious optimism filled the air. Something had broken and something new had begun, all because one person had stood up to a system designed to crush individual resistance. The next morning, Karen's house had a "for sale" sign in the front yard. Summer gave way to fall, and fall yielded to winter. The neighborhood transformed not just with the seasons, but with new leadership and purpose. The interim committee had worked diligently to revise bylaws, creating clearer definitions of rights and responsibilities for both the HOA and individual homeowners. The special assessment for water violation fines had been necessary, but the new board found ways to minimize the impact by cutting unnecessary expenses and reallocating funds from what they discovered had been an inflated legal defense account, money that had previously been used to intimidate residents who challenged board decisions. Most significantly, a new transparency requirement had been implemented. All board meetings were now recorded and minutes posted within 48 hours. Proposed bylaw changes required a 60-day notice period and community input sessions before any vote could occur. The neighborhood common areas had been redesigned with drought-resistant landscaping that, while initially less lush than the previous water-intensive gardens, had grown into something uniquely beautiful and sustainable. The state water department had reduced our restriction level in recognition of the significant improvements made. My pool remained private, as it should have been from the beginning. The new board had formally rescinded all community claims on it and issued a public apology for the previous administration's overreach. All fines and assessments against me had been canceled. Karen's house sold quickly, at a significant loss. The real estate agent confided that she had moved to a neighborhood without an HOA, perhaps having learned that rules cut both ways. Richard and most of the former board members avoided community events, though a few had made genuine efforts to repair relationships with neighbors they had previously targeted. On a crisp evening in early spring, nearly a year after the conflict began, I sat on the edge of my pool, watching the water ripple in the gentle breeze. The struggle had been exhausting but necessary, not just for me, but for every homeowner who had suffered under arbitrary enforcement and abuse of power. A knock at my gate interrupted my thoughts. It was Mrs. Chen holding a small potted plant. "I hope I am not disturbing you," she said with a smile. "Not at all," I replied, gesturing for her to join me. "What brings you by?" She placed the plant beside me. It was a water lily, its first bud just beginning to open. In my culture, water lilies represent peace and rebirth after struggle, she explained. I thought perhaps you might add it to your pool as a reminder. I thanked her sincerely, touched by the gesture. The new landscaping committee is asking for input on the community center redesign, she continued. They were hoping you might offer some guidance on water-efficient options. I would be happy to, I said, though strictly as a resident, not in my official capacity. She nodded understanding. Of course, we are learning to do things properly now. After she left, I carefully placed the water lily in the shallow end of the pool, where sunlight would reach it each morning. It seemed a fitting symbol for what our community had experienced, beauty emerging from turbulent waters. My phone buzzed with a message from the new HOA president, asking if I would review some proposed irrigation modifications before they submitted for permits. I replied that I would stop by tomorrow, not because I had to, but because being part of a community means contributing where you can.